Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Last Honest Realtor. I am your host, David Fleming. Thank you so much for joining me today because I'm going to talk about something that affects all of us. Well, at least it should if the system's working. That's taxation. It's a sexy topic, right? Maybe not. But it's something that's near and dear to me. No, not because I like taxes or I work for the CRA, but because, my mind never stops moving, as evidenced by the podcast, the blogs, and everything else I've done. And taxes are something that keeps me up at night, along with politics, to be perfectly honest, and real estate and finance and money and all those fun things that people love and hate. But remember that saying? You heard it early on in life, the three things you're never supposed to talk about: religion, money, and politics. Well, at least two of the three things intersect today because we are going to talk about politics. Of course, politics and taxes are impossible to divide. So I'll say this. The podcast today will be about all of the taxes that affect or are involved with real estate in one way or another. Having said that, it should come as no surprise that I'll make this disclaimer. I'm a fiscal conservative. Is that a bad word? It almost shouldn't be, right? A fiscal conservative. What does that mean? Well, it's someone that believes in being smart with money. No, look, we're not supposed to talk about politics. I don't know how many real estate agents are going to put the stuff out there that I certainly do, but I'm passionate about it and I believe in it. And dare I say, and this is going to come off as somewhat cocky, but I have the knowledge to back up some of the things I'm saying. And before you hate me for saying that, what I mean is that some of the taxes and some of just the thoughts on taxation in general and economics are often opined on by people that maybe haven't figured out the background to it. For example, and just as a very basic example, when it comes to economics, there are some people that believe, hey, it would be great if the government should pay for everything and people didn't have to work. And then it's like, well, wait, hold on. Then how would the government get money? Right? They create revenue through taxation. People get paid an income, and that's how we get GDP. That's how we get production, etc. So it's a very childish example, but my point is, the things I want to talk about today, I'm passionate about. I'm going to back it up with my thoughts, opinions, which are based on me being a fiscal conservative, but I will have the background that some of the people that argue about this don't. Is that fair? So saying that I'm a fiscal conservative, what does that mean? It means that over the weekend, there was an article in the National Post that said the luxury tax that the federal government brought in a few years ago collected $140 million, and it cost $19 million to implement that tax. For me, I would say, is it really worth it? Now, some people would say, hey, 140 million minus 19, that's revenue for the government. But I would then ask about fairness. It's funny because fairness in taxation could mean two completely different things. How about this take? If you really want it to be fair, why don't we all pay the same amount of taxes? No, right? Because that's crazy. No, fairness is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and we hear politicians constantly talking about fairness, and then this other thing, pay their fair share. So that's interesting. Now, the reason I brought up the luxury tax was because personally I'm not in favor for it. I will never own a boat or a plane, but I just think to penalize those people further, they already pay HST, they pay income tax, they pay all the taxes that we're going to talk about, but to penalize those people further in the name of fairness is crazy. Now, being a fiscal conservative, I'll also say that I believe politically governments should focus on, ready for this, wealth creation and not wealth redistribution, which unfortunately is what so much and so many of the governments have done over the years. So let's talk about the taxes themselves. Land transfer tax, Ontario non-resident speculation tax, municipal non-resident speculation tax, municipal development levies on new construction. That's a tax. Harmonized sales tax on new homes. It's got the word tax. It's a tax. HST on everything used to build new homes. Think about that. Anti-flipping tax, Toronto vacancy tax, underused housing tax, capital gains tax, and property tax. Tax. I can't believe how many taxes there are. Now, let's start with land transfer tax. And I believe that this is an exceptionally arbitrary tax. Now, I'm going to make a point, and it's not going to be a popular one with some people, but here goes. That forgive me for being cocky sort of thing I had said earlier. Anybody who believes that this tax has any link or anything to do with housing is either uninformed or they're angry, like so many people in the country that hate those that have, right? The land transfer tax has been around for so long that we've just taken it as a given. But if you take a step back and say, why do we pay so much money in land transfer tax? The answer can't be because. It can't be because it's always been that way, right? It can't just be a simple answer. Well, because we've always done it. Now, the answer also can't be because the city needs it. That's not a good enough reason. Now, why is there no land transfer tax on cars, right? We call it a car transfer tax. And I'm not talking about HST. I'm talking about just an absurd amount of money that you pay when you buy a car. Why is there no red seedless grape tax? I'm making a point, and I don't think it's a poor one. I think that the idea to charge a fee when transferring a title is fine. But we already pay that fee. There are fees associated with transferring title. The tax itself is egregious. Now, there are two taxes. The first was provincial. And I'm going to give you the history here because, and this is from an article in Real Estate Magazine, until April of 1974, Ontario did not have a land transfer tax. The government, which is conservative, fine, implemented this tax on April 10th, 1974. You know how much it was? 0.3% up to $35,000 and 0.6% of the balance. Now that sounds pretty crazy considering the 2s and 3s and 4s that we're used to now. Those are percentage. So the average house price at this time was $52,806, which means the average tax was $211.84. Now, 5 years later, it got worse. They increased the tax from 0.3% to 0.4%, and then the other portion on the balance from 0.6 to 0.8. Just throwing numbers at you, but you know where this is going. The average house price was $70,000 at the time. The average tax went up to $386. Now you can say, hang on a minute, house prices have risen, inflation, etc., but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars now. Now, 7 years later, it got even worse. 1986, they increased it to 0.5% up to $55,000, 1% in the next $195,000, and 1.5% in the balance. So the average land transfer tax went up to $1,114. 3.5 years later, June 1st, 1989, 0.5% on the first $55,000, 1% on the next $195,000, 1.5% on the next $150,000, and 2% on the balance. The average LTT was only $2,580, but the average house price was $273. So you're starting to see how, as a percentage, is pretty significant. Now, in the spring of 2008, we got the municipal land transfer tax. That was something. That was amazing. Now, I got into real estate in 2004. And in 2006, David Miller, who could only be described as a left-leaning socialist, whatever you want to call him, you don't like labels, okay, tell me I'm wrong, left-leaning mayor. And the City of Toronto Act of 2006 paved the way for this. City of Toronto implementing a new tax. And they wanted a land transfer tax. To me, I always thought it was ridiculous because we already have one. The province has it. You can't have your own because that would double the tax. But Mayor Miller just acted like it was a nothing burger. And I used to muse on my blog at the time. It's like being in a restaurant and just simply saying, oh, I'll have what that guy's having. But you can't just really? Wait, what? There's a tax and you want to have it as well, which means that it will double. It was crazy town. And you know what? People didn't want it. And the vote failed. The vote failed 23 to 22. That was in 2006. 23 to 22, and that should have been it. But Mayor David Miller was going to push this tax through. And the next year, they had a vote again, and it passed 26-19. If it didn't pass, he was going to pass it the year after. That tax was coming no matter what. And at the time, David Miller said, and I quote, "I think it's a vote of confidence in Toronto. I think what City Council did was vote for the future of this city in a way that says we've got confidence that our city's going to succeed. So we're prepared to say something very hard to people. Please pay a bit more." Remember at the onset, I told you that politicians always say, pay your fair share, pay a bit more, pay a bit more, pay a bit more. Now, the provincial tax, as I showed you, implemented in 1974, they paid a bit more, and then a bit more, and then a bit more, and then a bit more. They increased that tax 7 times. And now we're paying a bit more, which is a lot more because we are doubling it. It's absolutely wild. So David Miller said that this tax could bring in $150 million per year. No, it's going to bring in more. It's going to bring in, are you ready for this? Over $1 billion a year. Those are the figures. because it went up substantially, 184 million in 2009. 2015, it topped $500 million for the first time. 2021, it topped $1 billion for the first time. And then in 2023, I thought this was crazy. John Tory increased spending by $1.1 billion. And land transfer tax, of course, plummeted because there were fewer home sales. And then the city gets in this massive deficit, which is crazy because, as I said at the onset, the reason we have land transfer tax cannot be because the city needs it. It's not fair. One thing has nothing to do with the other. The tax itself has nothing to do with transferring title to a home. It's just simply saying we need money. Now, you could charge a tax on buying a car. You could charge a tax on buying red seedless grapes. You could charge a tax on anything. Walk down the street, look around, and just invent a tax. And unfortunately, that is so often what politicians do. Now, for people that are never going to buy again, they might like the tax. You know, seniors who constantly get crapped on, you know, they have everything, right? It was so much easier for them. Seniors might say, hey, listen, charge a higher land transfer tax because I ain't moving, right? And when property taxes go up, they go absolutely crazy. But the tax itself, to me, is so insane. It's so insane that we have taken this as a given, that we've just simply said, yeah, the city needs the money. And again, I say that there really is no link between the city's expenditures and the land transfer tax. It's one tax. It's one part of revenue generation. Of course, Mayor Chow has increased fees for parking. And remember when a $40 ticket went up to $80? Didn't Mayor Chow increase like 220 different parking fines? Sorry, I was way off topic there talking about revenue generation, but that's essentially what it is. Now, March of 2017, we increased it, you ready for this, to a 2.5% tax on the purchase price over $2 million. I mean, is that luxury? Is that where we are? We're luxury, right? $2 million. Can we not just admit that $2 million, we don't really want to admit it, but it gets you a house? It's not really a luxury house in Toronto. So at the time that this article was written in Real Estate Magazine, it notes the average price of real estate's gone up 1,300% since 1974, but the land transfer tax has gone up almost 10,000%. It's just about generating revenue. Now, in 2008, when David Miller brought in the tax, there was an article in the Globe and Mail. The headline says, Mayor's land transfer tax helped sink Toronto real estate market, study says. Here's an excerpt. Amid a sinking Toronto real estate market, Mayor David Miller's controversial land transfer tax is to blame for a significant chunk of falling sales and house prices, a study released by the C.D. Howe Institute today concludes. Take that for what you want. According to the study, Mr. Miller's tax, a levy of up to 2% on the province's existing levy, is responsible for a 16% drop in sales and a 1.5% drop in house prices in the city compared to the suburbs. Because, of course, this is a Toronto tax. And this, I'm assuming, study compared activity in Toronto versus activity out of Toronto and then concluded that it was the tax that did it. The evidence really suggests a very large impact, C.D. Howe Institute policy analyst Benjamin Dashis said in an interview. I'll let the evidence speak for itself. So there's one idea of what the tax did. But this notes, keep in mind that homebuyers get absolutely no benefit from paying the tax. It's simply a cash grab at a time when buyers typically are under the financial pressure that accompanies a move. I love that. It's basically what I had just said, except somebody else wrote it. I like that a lot. So we've got the two taxes. We've got the provincial, we've got the municipal. As I've mentioned, I think they're egregious. But there's more. Because if you were paying attention, Mayor Olivia Chow, when she came into power, wanted to increase land transfer tax yet again. And at the risk of being somebody on a podcast that's just simply complaining about taxes, I have to continue to bring this back to the very beginning and say, why? We can't just continue to increase the taxes. Has anybody ever thought to look at the expenditures? Now, again, there's probably a political line that I won't cross in this podcast and tell you what expenditures the city of Toronto or the province or the country has that I don't agree with. What programs and what pieces of assistance, what expenditures, all of the money that the city, the province, and the country spends. Sure, everybody can look at one expenditure versus another and say whether they do or not agree with it. But the fact that the city of Toronto is in this massive deficit, I mean, I don't think that increasing land transfer tax is the only way out. They could, of course, spend less money. So Mayor Chow came into power And there was a great article, again, from the C.D. Howe Institute. And it is the same Benjamin Dacus or Dachis, I don't know, apologies, who did the study in 2008. He wrote an open letter to Mayor Olivia Chow. Stuck in a hole, and the land transfer tax isn't your way out. This is what he said. Congratulations on your victory last month. As you take charge in your first full week, there's much conversation about the city's large financial problem. The most recent operating budget passed by council assumed $1 billion would come in provincial or federal support to fill an operating budget hole. Hundreds of millions of dollars of that total have yet to materialize in firm commitments. So the city needs to find money for that hole. Where do you find that? You guessed it. Your campaign promised new graduated land transfer tax rates on purchases of homes valued at over $3 million, $5 million, and $20 million. The City of Toronto is the only municipality in the province that has the authority to impose its own LTT. Remember, I mentioned that act from 2006. And in 2017, it introduced a new top marginal tax rate of 2.5% of the value of homes above $2 million. The provincial LTT, which also applies outside of Toronto, applies the same rates to the same brackets. Remember, I talked about Miller's doubling of the tax. Studies have generally found that LTTs have a relatively high economic cost because they discourage people from moving to more favorable locations or housing when they can do so. Instead, owners stay longer in their home, electing perhaps to renovate it. Based on an estimate of the impact of the LTT on land transfers in Toronto, a study I co-authored with Jack Mins and Bev Dalby in 2021 found that the current combined rate of 5% on homes in excess of $2 million is highly damaging in the housing market. Because add municipal and provincial, and we're talking about massive, massive numbers. Now, maybe you don't have sympathy for the person buying for $2 million that might pay $100,000. But again, I have to go back to the very beginning. Why? Why housing? We just take it as given. We take it for granted. How did this happen? It started out as hundreds of dollars. We're now talking about buying for $2 million and you're paying $100,000. Again, some people have absolutely no sympathy. And I'm interrupting my flow here to tell you a story. Chris and I once went to meet potential new buyers for coffee years ago. And they mentioned the land transfer tax as something that was going to be a sticking point in their purchase. And I, of course, said I had just sold a $4 million house and those clients had to pay $150,000 in land transfer tax. Now, that's half of what they would pay today, by the way. But the clients said, and I quote, "Yeah, but they can afford to." That doesn't make it okay. And this goes back to the idea of, I'm really getting political here, people who say things like, Jeff Bezos should have his wealth confiscated. Okay, I would say, but it's his. It's his. He made it, you know? Well, no one needs that much. Okay. But who makes that judgment? In the absence of God, which I don't believe in, is it you? You know, angry lady on the street corner? So again, I think I just interrupted a tangent with a tangent, but the point is, I think that this has some common sense to it, right? And the irony is, the person complaining about Jeff Bezos' wealth is probably using Amazon every day. The guy changed the world, right? I don't care. I do not care how much money he has. But it's this idea in some places of society that if someone can, they should. So the idea that someone who buys a $4 million house, quote, can afford to pay $300,000 in tax, it doesn't make it okay. How did we get to this point? So I'll continue with the letter to Olivia Chow from 2023. To gain some appreciation of how harmful that land transfer tax top rate is, we calculated the economic cost of reduced activity from the LTT using a method called the marginal cost of funds. If the combined rate were reduced from 5% to 4%, the MCF would still be 10.49. I feel like some people don't care and have stopped listening. I did that for a fact. Some people are not going to listen to any of this because they're going to say, I don't care, they should pay more. So much of taxation is about paying more, pay your fair share. What's fair? Jagmeet's saying, Canadians need to pay their fair share. Well, actually, it was the rich need to pay their fair share. Is 54% not enough? That's just on income tax. What about all the other tax? What about sales tax and property tax and capital gains tax? And anyways, sorry, I'm way off base here. So look, here's my point. I did that for effect. I don't need to read the statistics from the report because, well, for one thing, it's a podcast and it might be a bit boring, but also because so many people are just going to throw up their hands and say, I don't care. And that's the problem, as I said from the beginning. When you get into economic data and, links between interest rates and inflation and unemployment, a lot of people, they're uninformed, they don't understand it, or they don't care. And if we were to look at a study like this one from the C.D. Howe Institute that actually proves that this luxury land transfer tax is harmful, a lot of people say that they just do not care. So I'll save you the rest of that letter. It goes on. But the point is, Olivia Chow did it anyways, right? She brought this tax in, and an article, September 6th, 2023 in the CBC, headline, Toronto Council approves new measure to deal with grim financial situation. Again, I go back to this idea. Why has it fallen the housing market? Everything has fallen in the housing market. We have a housing crisis in this country, in this province, in this city. Do you think all the taxes have something to do with it? Now, I've done a podcast and on many blogs on how all of the taxes on new construction combine to make it unaffordable. This podcast is simply adding to that. Land transfer tax, $1 million. What are you paying? $30,000, $40,000? I know, they can afford to. Those bastards buying houses. How dare they buy a house? Shake them upside down by the ankles and take their money. 30 grand, 40 grand, do it. The city needs it. And again, I go back to this. The Toronto budget pressures are projected to grow to $46.5 billion in operating and capital shortfalls over the next decade. Here's the quote. If you look at the solutions in front of people tomorrow at council, the one that we are enacting immediately is called a mansion tax. She said, it is for people that are buying homes that are luxury homes that are expensive. The city staff said the measure could raise $26 million per year. $26 million? You probably spend that on fountain pens. $26 million. I go back to the idea of fairness. You really want to make it fair? Let's let everyone pay the same amount of tax. I used that bit already. So I don't understand how we got to this point. I cannot believe the amount of money that is associated with transferring the tax. And I do recall a time when, and this is just icing on the cake, the government implemented a $75 fee on the payment of the tax. That's a real kick in the teeth. You go to write your check for 40 grand, you got to pay a $75 fee to do it. Folks, that's land transfer tax. Let me take a quick break and I'll come back with some other tax beauties. Welcome back. Now, before the break, we talked about land transfer tax. There are two taxes, the provincial tax and the municipal tax here in the city of Toronto when you purchase a property. Now, I summarized by saying that I don't necessarily believe that paying $100,000 in transfer tax is fair or in any way necessary when buying a $2 million property. To each their own. And the city of Toronto has a massive deficit that they need to fill, which is why we brought in that luxury tax, which is going to increase the amount of revenue. And it's been around for so long that, as I noted, people have just taken it as a given. But there are many more taxes associated with real estate. And I want to go through a couple of those right now, which all kind of intersect. Now, the first one is the Ontario Non-Resident Speculation Tax, the NRST. Now, this was introduced in 2017, and it's a tax on the sale price of a home and is thus payable upon the purchase or transfer. Now, it sounds like the same thing as a land transfer tax, but of course it is paid by the buyer only if they are a non-citizen, a non-permanent resident, NPR, or a foreign-controlled company. Now, how you actually decide if that company is foreign-controlled or not, topic for another day. I might muse how much resources the government spend to ascertain whether or not that company is foreign-controlled. Again, topic for another day. Now, this tax was introduced at 15%, but was increased to a whopping 25%. Now, that's a lot of money. If you're buying $1 million property, and as we've established, you're paying $40,000 or $35,000 in land transfer tax, you're now paying $250,000 to the Ontario government in the form of a non-resident speculation tax. Now, ironically, the city saw what was happening and they said, I'll have that too. Now, it mirrors, that's a funny word, mirror. I'm going to come back to that. That was an Olivia Chow quote. Now, it mirrors, of course, what happened with land transfer tax, because the province had a land transfer tax from 1974 through 2006. The city of Toronto came along and they said, we want that as well. And of course, the Ontario non-resident speculation tax, which showed up first, led to the Municipal non-resident speculation tax, the MNSRT, right? The provincial government has a speculation tax, so why shouldn't the municipal government have one either? Now, Olivia Chow, of course, if she's shown us anything so far, it's that she's not afraid of new taxes or increased taxes. And a headline from CBC News, January 30th of 2024 says, Toronto's mayor's executive committee endorses a 10% speculation tax on foreign homebuyers. Okay. A few excerpts from the article, if I may. Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow's executive committee voted Tuesday in favor of creating a new municipal tax on foreign homebuyers who purchase property in Toronto. The city staff recommendation sailed through the committee by a show of hands. Of course it did, right? Here's a quote from Mayor Chow. It's an issue that's been well debated by other levels of government, and the executive committee members today endorsed it without much debate because it's been talked about for quite a few years now. It's a change that we should have made before. It's throwing Tory under the bus, am I right? And I'm glad that we're doing so. Now, from the article, it says the tax is meant to discourage international buyers from purchasing homes in Toronto in order to protect housing supply and maintain affordability, according to a staff report. Oh gosh, if we could talk about what goes into affordability, well, we just rewind and go through other podcasts. Now, the tax, which is 10%, is going to, quote, address Toronto's housing supply and affordability crisis. As I wrote in a blog, and here's where I get opinionated again, does anybody really believe that a tax is going to address affordability? What goes into affordability? Well, there's interest rates, which are a product of inflation, which is a product of government spending. There's, of course, the cost to build. There's supply and demand. There's the CMHC. There's so much that goes into affordability. And yet, of course, we're talking about a 10% tax addressing affordability. Now, a very cute line, and I mentioned this before. Mayor Chow said the tax will, quote, mirror the provincial tax for the exact same thing. Now, I thought it was funny because the word mirror, she's saying we're going to mirror it. I would use the word double. They have a tax, you're bringing in a tax. You're doubling it. You're mirroring it. That is so cute. Now, the irony of these two taxes, the Ontario non-resident speculation tax at 25% and the very cute mirroring tax that Mayor Chow brought in, right? We need to ask people to pay their fair share of 10%. Neither of them are needed. Why? Well, because of something called the Prohibition on the Purchase of Residential Property by Non-Canadians Act, aka the Foreign Buyer Ban. It's kind of funny. The federal government introduces a foreign buyer ban, and although foreign buyers are banned from buying real estate, Mayor Olivia Chow brings in a foreign buyer tax. How can you tax people if they're banned from buying? Now, this Prohibition on the Purchase of Residential Property by Non-Canadians Act, that's a mouthful, was passed in 2022 and took effect in 2023. So in all seriousness, this ban came in after the provincial government had instituted their 25% tax, but well before Mayor Chow decided to bring in her 10% tax. Now, the Act defines residential property as buildings with 3 dwellings or less, and thus the Act does not prohibit the purchase of any building or property with 4 or more units. That's very important. Now, the Act sought to ban non-citizens and non-permanent residences, as well as foreign control companies, from buying property in Canada for 2 years. There are so many loopholes in this, I'm not going to get into it today, but the statistic that I promised a little bit earlier. Statistics Canada provided data on the largest 2 markets in Canada, Toronto and Vancouver, respectively, showing that 2.6% of homes in Toronto and 4.3% homes in Vancouver were owned by non-residents. That's not a lot. But we banned foreign buyers and we introduced 2 taxes on them. Now, moving on, because there are so many taxes to get through, did you know we have a federal anti-flipping tax? Now, this tax does not have a sexy name like some of the other ones. It's not part of a new act. It's merely legislation within the existing tax code that, as of January 1st, 2023, includes the profits gained from property flipping as fully taxable income rather than a capital gain. Capital gain, capital gain, capital gain. It's echoing in my brain. We're going to come back to the capital gains. Now, a capital gain only allows, let's change that to allowed, for 50% of the profit to be taxed. I promise we'd come back to it because you all know where this is going. But business income allows a CRA to tax it all. So consider the difference between business income and a capital gain. Now, I will tell you that years and years and years ago, I heard from the CRA, and they told me that because I had purchased and sold a condo, and I think this is in like 2007, they believed it was a, quote, adventure in the nature of trade. Now, normal people, when they hear they're going on an adventure, might be excited. My accountant told me, no, this is a bad adventure. An adventure in the nature of trade means that this is what you do for a living. I said, well, that's not true. This is merely one condo that I have purchased and sold. The government said, no, it's an adventure, one in the nature of trade, and decided to tax me on all of it and not just the capital gain. Now, the time period for what will define flipping, according to this new tax code, is 1 year. And while there are lots of exceptions, the intent of the tax is quite clear. Like the other taxes, this is going to discourage people. No, it's going to generate revenue. Now, of course, there are two sides to that coin. Flip it upside down. On one side, it says this is about deterring people, deterring foreign buyers. We need to deter foreign buyers. We need to deter people from flipping. On the other side, it's about revenue generation. And my cynical side says, hey, listen, I respect your opinion either way, but back it up with something more than because. Now, wouldn't this decrease the supply of housing when you think about it? Right? Because it could theoretically stop someone from buying a home and improving it and selling it. It could stop someone from selling a home for fear of having to pay the tax in the first place. So, of course, if you purchased a property and then, oh my gosh, I'm moving to New York for a great job opportunity, I don't want to pay the anti-flipping tax, so I won't sell it. Well, there's one last property going on the market. And in all seriousness, we did represent somebody recently who is, what do you call them? Fortunate? No, they're not fortunate. They're successful. And they did purchase a property and then they decided they wanted to sell it. And they were like, well, I don't want to pay the tax. So we'll just keep it empty. And then we'll pay the 1% vacancy tax because it's a hell of a lot less than we'd be paying otherwise. So since when is buying a home, improving it, and selling it a bad thing? You know, it generates more land transfer tax for the province and the city. It employs tradespeople for the renovation, requires a purchase of goods and services, of which HST is paid to the government, and it creates taxable capital gains, the balance of which would likely be invested back into the economy. So there's my political side and my analysis side questioning the federal anti-flipping tax. To each their own. Come to your own conclusion if you'd like. But let's move on to the federal increase on capital gains. Now, I mentioned all the taxes associated with real estate. And of course, when you sell a property in Canada that you live in, you benefit from the greatest exemption out there. Me being exempted from final exams in high school in the 1990s for getting over 70%. Oh, no, sorry, I don't know where I was going with that. But it's true. It was a word. Did you get exempted? Were you exempted? Anybody who got over 70% didn't have to write final exams. I guarantee they don't do that today because it's probably not fair. No, the greatest exemption ever was the exemption for a capital gain on your primary residence. You buy it, you live there with your family, you raise them, and when you sell it, you're not taxed on it. That's great. That's really great. But if you're a business or if you bought it, lived in it, and then rented it out, you're going to pay a capital gains. Now, in the 2024 federal budget, they proposed, without really telling us how, which is so common, to increase the capital gains inclusion tax June 25th, 2024, from 50% to 66.67, rounded up, that's 2/3, for corporations and trusts, and from 50% to 66.67 on the portion of capital gains realized in the year that exceeded $250,000 for individuals. That's a mouthful to basically say your capital gains tax went up. Now, this is so cute. The website, if you go to it for the Government of Canada, the headline says, fair and predictable capital gains taxation. Oh my God. I told you I was going to get political, right? But like, is that not just a little bit of brainwashing, right? They didn't say capital gains increase. Fair and predictable capital gains taxation. What made this more predictable? I don't think anything. Fair? I mean, okay, yeah, maybe it's fair. We can debate that later. Now, these changes will make Canada's tax system fairer by making taxation more income neutral. Sorry, what? That's on the website from the Government of Canada. I'm going to repeat it. These changes will make Canada's tax system fairer by making taxation more income neutral. Okay, all right, I'm with you. I guess they're talking about how people make their money. I know I'm not following. It's just really increasing a tax that has to do with real estate. So again, I would ask, will it generate enough revenue? Will it force people to sell their homes, putting more on the market? Will it force people to keep their homes? To be determined. And that's where you have things like studies from the C.D. Howe Institute. Now, here's a beauty for you. A little something called, ready for it, the Toronto vacancy tax. Oh my God. This is, of course, a newer tax. City Council voted in December of 2021 to create a tax on vacant properties. Now, as we are always told, that the goal here was to force the owners of empty homes to lease them out or to sell them. Now, in theory, it's a great idea. We need to force people sitting on empty properties to put them out there for folks to either buy or rent, but in either way to live in them. Again, great in theory. I have always said I don't believe the way to get past a problem is to tax your way out of it. I've never believed that, if Billy jumps off the climber and breaks his ankle, the way to help Billy is to tax ankle sprains. Now, what the actual goal was is up for debate, but the initial estimates were that the tax would bring in $62 million in the year 2022. The tax was set at 1% of the value of the home. If you recall, we had serious issues with their website. We had serious issues with the senior population not necessarily knowing how to go and do it through the World Wide Web. We had language issues, and of course, it did not bring in the expected revenue. But I, along with some others, some other people and some others about this tax and other taxes, believe that maybe this wasn't so much about forcing people to put their homes in the market as much as it was about revenue generation. So again, some people say, listen, I live in my home and I'm there 365 nights a year. I don't care what happens with vacant homes. The problem, of course, was that this tax generated 169,000 complaints and 108,000 vacant home tax charges were reversed as of April 12th, 2024. That's a problem to me. Now, if you go back to the original statement, Mayor Olivia Chow said, Toronto is facing a generational housing crisis and the city must do everything it can to help residents who are looking for a place to live. The vacant home tax is one tool the city can use to address the issue of housing supply by discouraging homeowners from letting their residential properties sit empty while so many people search for long-term accommodation. And if homeowners choose to keep their properties vacant, they will pay a tax with the revenue being used to fund affordable housing initiatives. Now, I go back to the idea of this being impossible to do as a podcast topic with not providing my 2 cents in politics. Guys, I never thought I would see a day when I have to solemnly declare and swear that at night I put my head on a pillow in my own bed. Yikes. Tough one, right? But yeah, I think it's crazy. And it's not about the revenue generation or, the power or anything like that. I just think that it's so far off base that it offends me as a Canadian. And that might sound like overkill, but I just have never seen more people in Canada that are so quick to give up their rights. Let's use a lesser example. Let's say you own a house and there's a tree and you want to cut it down. All right, I'm losing a lot of people here because it provides shade, it provides oxygen, and it's 100 years old, and we can't cut it. I don't want to be like a crazy right winger in the United States, But at the same time, maybe, cutting down the tree in your own yard for a house that you own, that you bought, where you pay property taxes, okay, let's call it a gray area. It depends on the tree. My point is this, guys. I just think that of all the taxes we've analyzed, to me, this is the craziest one. It was ruled out so poorly. It doesn't really generate a lot of revenue. And the fact that they are going to fine us for not declaring that we sleep in our own bed. Like my mother, she doesn't own 50 investment properties, right? She lives in her own house and she has to declare that she lives in her own house. And you might say, well, David, there's no other way to do it. Okay, well, yeah, maybe not. I mean, I did see, and this is amazing. Are you ready for this one? You can feel the sarcasm dripping. I did see a suggestion from somebody, I wish I had this printed, who said that there's got to be a better way, perhaps like monitoring the electricity and water usages for properties. Are you kidding? That's what we're going to do now? We're going to spy on people? We're going to monitor the water and electricity charges for houses to try to source out vacant homes. Might be off base now talking about real estate and taxation, but hey, how can we have one thing without the other? talking about the taxes and then opining on the efficiency or the need for them. So the vacancy tax is going to also triple. Did I mention that? Maybe I could have led with that. Started at 1%. It's going to triple to 3%. And I'll leave you with this final thought. If you are in your 70s and you bought a house, 30 years ago, you have been paying taxes, you have been paying property taxes as well, paying income tax, property tax, law abiding, and you want to spend 6 months of the year in Florida. Should you be penalized for that? That's some food for thought. Now, the next tax I want to talk about is, wait a minute, didn't we just do this? The underused housing tax? Huh? Sounds a lot like the vacancy tax, but did you know there is a federal UHT underused housing tax? It's a tax that came into effect January 1st, 2022, and applies to any residential property in Canada that the CRA considers underused or vacant. It's a 1% tax. And according to the website, quote, this tax generally applies to foreign national owners of housing in Canada. However, in some situations, this tax applies to some Canadian owners, such as certain partners, trustees, and corporations. Okay. Now, the problem with this tax, tinfoil hat, okay, put it on your head. There are some people in society who believe that this tax is really just a way for the government to get a peek into the financials of Canadian corporations. I've heard that from lawyers and accountants. And again, many people say, I don't care. My name's Jenny, and I rent. My name's Bruce, and I bought a one-bedroom condo, and I don't care about the underused housing tax. I don't care about capital gains. I don't care about foreign buyers. I get it, guys. My job here in this podcast is to name and describe all of the taxes associated with real estate, and then, of course, provide you with my slightly right-of-center commentary. Now, this underused housing tax, to me, is a little scary, because what does the CRA consider underused? See where I'm going with this? Well, what if, my mother's 4-bedroom house that she lives in alone is underused? When is, oh my God, are we going to go off on this tangent? When is the federal government going to knock on my mother's door and say, hello, we hear you have 3 vacant bedrooms. Sorry, we need them for people. I know I'm being ridiculous, except if you look at all of these taxes combined, and look, I have no problem with a land transfer tax. I think it's too much. And I really have no problem with a capital gains tax, but they increased it. I don't believe that the speculation taxes, the flipping taxes are actually good for the economy. And when it comes to things like vacant home taxes and underused housing taxes, I think it's a slippery slope towards the government kind of telling us, how to best use our homes. Now, moving on, I want to talk about municipal development charges. This is a big one. Now, just because it's a charge or a levy doesn't mean it's not a tax. I have done full podcasts on this, so I'm going to try to go through this quickly. From a Build report, Build being the Building Industry and Land Development Association, which I wrote about on my blog on Monday, the total municipal fees per unit of housing in Mississauga are $225,627 for low rise, consider a semi or a detached, and $157,643 per high rise, so per a condo. Now that leads the pack. Here in the city of Toronto, the total municipal fees per unit of low rise housing is $195,000. Guys, just listen. For every home built that's a new home, there's almost $200,000 of municipal fees or levies. And in a condo, it's $134,000. That is absolutely outrageous. Now, we're pretty well into this podcast by now. I think the idea of me not placing blame on the various governments for taxing us to death has well passed. But can you honestly look at this and tell me that this makes sense when we're in a housing crisis? Doesn't to me. Now, development fees have always been around. The issue with the fees is that they have continued to increase exponentially, just like land transfer tax. It's like we have a tax and it's bringing in money. And when we need more of it, instead of coming up with new taxes, or of course, God forbid, reducing expenditures, we decide to increase those existing taxes. Now, in 2022, when of course we were talking nonstop about the housing crisis, this was when the city of Toronto issued a release saying that they were going to increase development charges by 46%. 46% in 2022. Now that brought the tax at the time, as I mentioned, for low rise up to $137,000. That was a 46% increase from 2021 to 2022. But did you catch where I said that last year was 195,832, according to the build report. How much have the municipal development charges gone up, say, in the last 4 years? Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Is it any wonder why real estate is expensive? Now, moving on, how about the harmonized sales tax? Harmonized. That's so nice. Harmonized sales tax of 13% on new homes. Now, if you go and buy a house for $1 million from a developer, you're not paying $130,000 or 13% on top of it. That would be crazy. No, it's built in. So if we could get, mathematician in here pretty quickly to reverse engineer this. Look, you're paying $850,000, $870,000, something like that. The tax is added on and the developer charges $1 million. Now, there are rebates, of course. Okay. But the point is the government's getting their money. By rebates, I mean you're paying it and then you get it back. The government is getting that money. 13% built into the price of new housing. And oh my God, did we just talk about municipal development charges? So I did a full podcast on this. I did full blogs on this. And it resulted in actually somebody who used to work for the city in development charges emailing me personally and saying he didn't like it, which I thought was awesome because it means that I was on the right track. So imagine 13% on the cost of new homes. And, people may not care about these luxury taxes, cars, watches, yachts, etc. But it's one thing to pay 13% on your Starbucks coffee. It's another thing to pay 13% on the cost of a new home. Now, last year, the federal government removed a portion of the HST on the construction of new rental housing, and the provincial government soon followed suit. But that tax revenue will be made up somewhere, as we know is the case with all taxes. The HST on new homes remains and drastically drives up the price. Now, while we're talking about HST, how about the HST on everything else? So, real estate fees. Oh, they're so high. I hate real estate agents. You pay HST on it because it's a service, just like you would if you got a massage or something on that nature. Now, what about the lumber that you buy to build a house? Now, of course, a good accountant, if it's an adventure in the nature of trade, can claw that back. But you think about the 13%. HST that is on every single other thing we have to do with housing, whether it's furniture, whether it's items used to build a home. There are so many things we could come up with in a list to think about how much of real estate has a 13% tax applied to it. Now, last but not least, property taxes. And I certainly am not against property taxes. In fact, I've always maintained that we have the lowest property taxes anywhere, that is here in the city of Toronto. And I made the argument earlier on today that the older generation who never plans to move are so in favor of higher land transfer tax, but are saying, don't increase my property taxes. Now, earlier this year, Olivia Chow announced a 10.5% tax hike. And she decided to decrease it all the way down to 9.5%. So ironically, she made overtures about a 16.5% tax increase. And I think that might have been smart because, when a developer wants to build a 40-story tower where 40 stories don't belong, they'll apply for 62 stories, right? And they'll just work backwards towards 40. I think maybe Mayor Chow put this out there. We might have a 16.5% tax increase. And then when it was only 10.5, which was clawed back to 9.5, it didn't seem so bad. So guys, I have a massive mess of papers here. And I also potentially made a massive mess of what was supposed to be a very orderly, structured breakdown of all the taxes associated with real estate by injecting my opinion. But that's the thing, as I said at the very onset, is that the things you're not supposed to talk about in life, taxes, politics, money, religion, they're all intertwined here. There are so many taxes that apply to the purchase or sale or construction or oversight or interaction with real estate people, and anyone and anything that has to do with the entire industry. How's that for a catch-all? I cannot make sense of it. And why I say that this angers me is not because, and I always get accused of this, well, because you sell real estate for a living. No, listen, I have a great business. I enjoy what I do. Don't get me wrong. I go back to the idea of being a Canadian. I go back to the idea of being a Torontonian. And I go back to the idea of, land transfer tax, that's a lot. That really makes it expensive. And oh boy, the development charges and the HST on new construction, that really makes it expensive. And the vacant home tax, okay, what about the person that's retired and they want to enjoy the rest of their life? And are we going to punish them? What about the idea that you've given up potentially some of your freedoms by, allowing something like that to happen, or having the government look into corporations to decide what what real estate holdings they have and whether the underused housing tax should apply. And so I understand that, these views are, I joke about tinfoil hat. I might joke about libertarian. I might joke about right of center, but man, tell me I'm not wrong about the amount of taxes, land transfer, speculation, anti-flipping, vacant home, underused, municipal, non-resident tax, provincial non-resident tax, HST, property tax. That's it? Is that it? Is that where all this mess of papers are? So as a conclusion, I guess for you, the viewer and listener, if you've made it this far, it's up to you to decide, am I on the right track? Does the government need all this money? Well, they need it. Governments need money. They spend it on roads and schools and hospitals and programs and millions of other things that fall under the purview of a government. And they need revenue from taxation to do that. So I'm not standing here today telling you that we're overtaxed as far as real estate goes, because I don't believe that governments should spend money on necessary things. I am saying that maybe, just maybe, it shouldn't all come from real estate, which has basically been the golden goose over the last 20 years that I've been in the business. Eventually, you are going to choke that golden goose to death, as far as the analogy goes. How long can you continue to drive up the price of real estate and continue to make things unaffordable for people, while at the same time saying we're trying to increase affordability? How long can you continue to increase development charges before, wait a minute, no, that happened. People stop buying pre-construction. And when people stop buying pre-construction, developers stop building it. Ergo, housing shortage. Ergo, housing crisis. So follow the breadcrumb trail that I'm putting out for you here, guys. I just don't think that you can talk about affordability in real estate as a government and continue to talk about all of the taxes, because that's kind of what makes it unaffordable. Agree or disagree? I'm happy to chat further. Happy to answer your questions in the comments. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you're watching on YouTube, as I said, feel free to leave a comment. If you're listening wherever you get your podcasts, please remember to like, comment, or subscribe. And thank you for listening to me here today on The Last Honest Realtor.